Hi everyone! Declassify is finally returning this month with our 5th episode. We're already just past halfway through this season. I just wanted to quickly thank everyone who has continued to listen to the podcast, particularly everyone who's listening in Australia, the States, France, and the UK, the 4 places where most of you are from. Of course, this definitely does not discount everyone else, but I thought I'd just do a little shout out to the majority of you who have been listening on to season 2. Just quickly before I get into the grit of introducing today's remarkable guest, I will let you all know that if you hear any muffled sounds or sudden bumps or bangs, it's not anything dramatic. It's just because where I'm recording this episode right now in the UK, it just happens to be Guy Fawkes night or bonfire night. So you might catch some moments in the background with lots of fireworks, and apologies for that. But now, straight in. As I'm sure you would have noticed from the title, today's podcast guest is none other than cross-genre whiz and interdisciplinary extraordinaire, composer, performer, producer, and curator Danielle Eva Schwob. Currently based across New York City and Los Angeles, Danielle is a staggeringly active artist and musician who works and operates across multiple forms and disciplines. Her music has been featured broadly and at a remarkable range of venues, including the Lincoln Center, at the Metropolitan Museum of Art, the BRIC Celebrate Brooklyn, and Philip Glass's Matter Festival, just to name a few. Additionally, she has also been a Sundance Institute Composers Lab Fellow, a Con Edison ETM Composer in Residence, and an ACA Associate Artist in Residence. I sort of feel like I cannot even begin to cover all of the aspects of your practice, so thank you so much and welcome aboard to the podcast, Danielle.
Thank you. Well, thanks for having me. It's a really great podcast, and I'm very happy to be part of it.
Thank you very much. Well, I always struggle to ask the first question because it's completely different for everyone, and for you in particular, because I was listening to your work and watching your work as well. Because for anyone who's listening who doesn't know, you're a composer, a songwriter, a performer, and I can see a keyboard and synths and several guitars behind you.
Yeah.
And you direct and produce and edit all your visual and film work.
Some of them. There are some other collaborators involved, so I don't want to be taking credit for their work. But yeah, I've edited quite a few of them and directed some as well, and I'm doing increasingly more of that as time goes on.
Well, because it's so broad and so interdisciplinary, I was wondering, how did that happen? Was that always your plan to combine all these different fields together, or did it kind of just happen over time and organically?
A bit of both. I think growing up, my favorite artists were always the ones who kind of worked across genres and, had very exciting and eclectic careers where even if they weren't necessarily working in separate mediums, they brought influences from other genres into the one that they were working in. So, that could be anything from big rock bands like Pink Floyd, Radiohead, Bjork, those sorts of people. And then on the classical side, the Philip Glasses of the world, who really collaborated with lots of other people and also produced these massive operas and ballets and projects that really involved other artists. And then I guess as far as the visual piece of this, that was something that happened completely accidentally, because as I was starting to put out music, we needed visuals to go with all of the different pieces that would live online, because in my opinion, actually, people say that music videos and that side of things are dead, now that MTV is no longer the sort of cultural dictator that it used to be. But I actually think the opposite is true, because we rarely consume music now without a visual attached to it, given how we interact with it online. And so I started working on visuals just out of necessity. And then because I'm a control freak and I like to do everything as well as I possibly can, I just ended up getting involved with that. It's not really in my nature to not meddle in things. So anything that I'm working on, I tend to kind of put my hands into. And then over time, it's just grown to be a medium that I enjoy. And it's a space to kind of round out the aesthetic world that I'm trying to create and give it a context for people to understand it.
And you mentioned before about all the music videos. Do you think in the realm outside of the realm of popular culture or more contemporary pop and rock music, do you think that's something that's the classical music world is starting to bring into its aesthetic?
Absolutely. I'm certainly not the first person to be exploring visual. I hate the C word, content, but visual content in combination with with music. Yeah, I mean, really, I think anyone who's aspiring to create something that's part of culture in a way, well, internet culture, like I was saying before, you kind of come up against visuals that you can't really avoid it. And so I think that there are more and more composers doing it, and it's certainly something that I'm interested in going forward. And I think it also ties in with the film scoring world in a way that's interesting. So even if you're making music for the concert hall, people, like general audiences outside of the classical world, tend to kind of like associate orchestras with soundtracks. And even if you're not necessarily writing classical music that sounds like a soundtrack, there's a lot of space for sort of instrumental music to be in conversation with visuals, just because I think that audiences expect that to a certain degree. Does that make sense? I feel like
yes.
Yeah. Okay,
well, actually, just I remember as a young chorister, or still a chorister, if we're doing concerts with the symphony orchestra, as soon as it's one with a film score, we see a completely different audience show up. They tend to be a lot younger and much more diverse. So I actually think adding visuals to classical music has made it much more accessible as a form of art to the broader public.
I think so too. I mean, really, at the end of the day, I think that both are they're mediums that are designed to like elicit emotional. I mean, like any form of art, they're sort of creations and expressions that are designed to like elicit an emotional reaction from people. And I think there's a lot to be gained from combining them. And I think that's something that could certainly be explored more in classical music, and something that I've been starting to do.
So if you don't mind me asking, was it...
Please, we're here for you to ask. So ask away.
Well, was it classical music first in your training that then it kind of expanded into more popular music?
It's always been kind of a mishmash, to be honest. I think I started off, my earliest musical memories were of my dad playing classical guitar in my house, and my mum, playing records by rock bands. And then when I first started to play, I tried guitar. I had a brief stint with cello, which obviously, sets you down the classical road more so than some other instruments. And then I picked up electric guitar as a teenager, and there were some recorders along the way too. So it's just always been both. I've always just ping-ponged between the two, I think. I mean, I first started off playing classical guitar. And when I say playing classical guitar, I'm not a classical guitarist, but it was like 7-year-old classical guitar. So approximations of flamenco and Bach and all of that when I was a kid. And then, started writing songs when I discovered rock music as a teenager and started playing electric guitar. So I've always gone back and forth. And then I studied classical music. I hate calling it classical music as well, because obviously that's, we all know the baggage that comes along with this terminology. And I feel like no one's really settled on like the right word to distinguish this kind of work from film or anything like that. But I end up just calling it classical music sometimes, because that's what other audiences do. Concert music, chamber music, whatever. I studied composition at university, but I was playing in rock bands alongside that. And there hasn't really been a time when I haven't done both.
I like that you mentioned the fact that you don't want to call it classical music, because that's actually one of my questions was, what should we call it instead? But I suppose that's a very loaded question.
I think it depends on who you are talking to. Within the composing world, new music, contemporary music, chamber music, whatever, I feel like all of that stuff is fine. But when you're speaking to someone who is more sort of a general listener, it's often categorized as classical music, and that doesn't really bother me anymore. I think it's there's no word that fits, but we have enough words that we at least know what we mean when we're talking about things.
Exactly.
What do you like?
Well, I mean, I've been trying to use art music, because that's something that
I was about to say, I like that one.
Yeah, I've been trying to use that. Or someone also mentioned to me that it should be just called the Western Western canon, traditional or Western art music. But now I feel like that could have worked perhaps in the 19th century, but we've moved to how the world works. It's so globalized and so connected that it's not just Western music anymore, or
it's true.
that tap into that.
Yeah, I mean, I was about to say some of the best stuff in the world for the concert hall, quote unquote, is coming out of Asia. So you can't really call it Western classical. It doesn't make any sense. I like art music though. I think that one's nice.
Well, I suppose that possibly leads into the next question. This might be a slightly self-serving question for me, but how do you manage all of the different disciplines all in one? The type of music is integrated, but how does the visual and everything flow on? Because you have a lot of projects and a lot of albums that seem to come out regularly.
With difficulty, I would say. I don't really have a good answer to that question. It's an ongoing project, just figuring out how to organize all of these various projects. And if I'm being totally honest, I usually feel like whatever I'm doing, I'm shortchanging something else, and it's just kind of a messy balancing act. I'd say when I'm kind of in a good flow of things, I write in the mornings and I do administrative work in the afternoon. Sometimes one kind of bleeds into the other, but leading up to a big project, it's so that gets off. So I'd say my ideal is really just being quite disciplined about how I structure my day. Sometimes that works. I find I can sort of maintain a routine for about maybe 3 weeks to a month, and then something happens where it shifts and I have to go somewhere, or the demands of one project end up sort of overtaking others, and it's a work in progress at all times. I don't know, maybe you feel like that too. I know that you're also a composer and interdisciplinary person.
Yes, it does feel like that a lot of the time. I try to make a routine, but it kind of fails every month because, again, different projects come in or different collaborators like to work differently, and then I just have to adjust it.
Yep. Yeah, I think I just try and do my best with staying organized at all times.
Well, because I mentioned collaboration, how much do you think that way of working has changed, or if it has changed at all, changed the art scene and classical music scene in the last 20, 30 years?
Well, not having been around before that, it's difficult to say. Has it changed? I don't know. Not having been alive in a different era, it's difficult to say. I suppose that there's more crossover now with so-called indie classical musicians and indie rock musicians and maybe film people to a certain degree. But I think that like other genres that are more collaborative have sort of traditions and practices from those genres have found their way into classical music. And you have like all of these chamber groups that sort of form that feel very much like rock bands and work with one another over long periods of time and sort of collaborate and build brands and like small, I mean, brand is kind of a dirty word for classical music, but build like visual identities and sort of, presentations of their work that, feels very much like a rock band. But equally, I don't know, I mean, there was the Philip Glass Ensemble and Steve Reich has had many of his groups. So maybe it's not really that different. I'm not sure. Perhaps it's just that the sound is slightly different.
Or perhaps maybe because of social media, they feel more present because we have direct access.
Yeah, exactly. Or it's just in our faces and we kind of know how the cookie's made in a way that we didn't before.
Do you think the larger kind of big ensembles that I imagine most of the public associates with classical music could do with a bit more collaborative modeling?
I do. I mean, I do think that there are some that are really being very innovative with their programming and pushing boundaries and involving artists from all sorts of genres, and then also giving their young, quote unquote, classical or art music, whatever we're calling it, composers, more free reign in how they interact with the musicians in the ensemble. Like I think the LA Phil is doing a great job with that. I think the New York Phil could perhaps learn something. But I think it's changing very, very slowly. I would like to see it change more quickly.
I also agree.
Yeah.
It's completely different scene in Australia, the one that I'm most familiar with. So when I moved to the UK, I was kind of surprised by the amount of support they had for young composers. It's not as much as, say, the LA feel, but it was way more than what it was like in Australia, which is a very conservative scene. And you hear the music from the three Bs the most, so Bach, Beethoven, and Brahms.
Oh, good. Yes. Not to knock them, but I think there's room for some new blood, for sure.
Yeah, I agree. And I think there was some statistical study recently done just generally with composers. I think 62% of music that is performed in a concert hall is written by a dead German.
That's terrible. And I'm not someone who's opposed to erasing the three Bs from programming altogether. I mean, they're part of the job of orchestras is to kind of function almost like museums, to keep that writing alive, because it's part of our tradition and our sort of artistic heritage and everything. But they also have to evolve and reflect current times as well. And it's difficult to see how if programming is focused so much on the past, it's difficult to see how it could really be part of the present and involved in shaping culture. And I think it's a wasted opportunity, because the orchestras, it's one of the greatest human inventions, in my opinion, and there's so much space for it in mainstream culture in general. And I think it's the job of these institutions to really figure out how they can be part of that, whether they see it or not. But yeah, some are, some aren't. I'm hopeful for the future. We shall see.
Yes, I'm also hopeful. I would hate to see them die out, because I grew up loving the sound of the orchestra. So it would be great if it opened up, because there are so many people I know who are just afraid of entering the concert hall space because it feels so foreign or academic to them.
But it seems like I think the UK is doing a decent job with that. You're in, is it Cambridgeshire?
Cambridgeshire at the moment.
Well, something that I felt growing up in the UK is that there's generally less of a distinction between sort of high and low culture in general. I grew up not thinking, I grew up considering sort of like being in a mid-tier indie rock band to be just as viable and valuable and respectable a career as being the concertmaster at the London Symphony or the Philharmonia or something like that. And I think in general, I can't speak for Europe in broadly, but just in terms of the UK, I think there's just a lot of respect for creators in general, be it someone who's sort of working in these more conventionally perceived high art spaces, or someone who's like a really great advertising executive who comes up with these like fantastic campaigns that integrate like really cool music, and they're relevant and they're funny and they're creative. And I think I always just grew up perceiving that as being creativity, and that being valuable in general, and not really one being any better than the other. But then when I moved to the US, it felt much more segregated, which I think is a shame.
Do you think it's improved in your time in the US?
I don't know. I think I've just been here for so long now that I'm like the frog that's been boiled in water and doesn't really notice.
Yeah.
I have no idea. It feels normal to me. And I guess I haven't changed in how I see any of this stuff. And I think I've kind of picked up collaborators along the way who see the world and music and creation similarly. So I have no idea whether the world in general, well, the scene in general here has changed, but I've certainly found kind of people to keep in my bubble who work the same way.
So when you're collaborating with this group of people, or if you're directing something, do you ever try very hard to make things accessible in the way that you integrate and work with your team so it doesn't feel segregated?
I mean, I'd say that generally everything that I'm working on, while I think it has influence, I think often projects sort of bear influence from other areas of music or art or whatever. They tend to be kind of grounded in one tradition, really. So for the most part, I try and meet collaborators where they are. I think there's a lot to be said for like collaboration in general. I think in its ideal form, you meet each other halfway and you push each other to expand on your kind of skill sets and horizons and perspectives and abilities. But you also need to kind of bring what you're good at to the table as well. And so I think there's always kind of a dance that happens where you're trying to figure out where the boundaries are and where you can push someone, where you should just let them kind of do their thing. And it goes both ways. And for the most part, like, I wouldn't ask a virtuoso, quote unquote, classical violinist to show up and play like on a rock record unless I knew that they had that kind of skill set in their wheelhouse, because that's not, if a player shows up and like isn't playing something that they sound their best on, that's not fun for them, that's not fun for you. The end product sort of suffers. And so I think a lot of it is really, really trying to pick the right people for the project, and find collaborators who make sense given what you're trying to make. But then, I don't know, sometimes you find people who are kind of really, really wonderfully versatile, and you can throw them into any kind of situation and they'll be fine. Working with Public Quartet was like that, where they're just this like singular freaky group of musicians who can play the 3 Bs perfectly. They can also play jazz, they also write, they also play rock music, and you can kind of bend them and shape them really in any direction, which was so much fun as a composer to be working with players like that.
Very cool. Well, actually, that's one of my list of questions, which was I was
great.
going to ask what it was like working with them on Out of the Tunnel.
So fun. Yeah, like I said, they're such incredibly versatile players that it was really just kind of a treat and a way. It's one of the projects where I feel like I've been most able to integrate like different skill sets and influences most effectively, I guess, because they, like I said, you can kind of just throw anything at them and they can play it. But also their voice is so much in line with what I feel mine is, in that it's art music, chamber music, whatever we're calling it for the purposes of our conversation. They come from that tradition, but they also like really have a rock spirit to them. That quartet sounds like a rock band, and that was really fun to play with, just because I think in the long run that's what I've been interested in doing within my work as a composer. It's creating music that's virtuosic and very much has grown from the traditions of chamber music, classical music, art music. I feel like we do need to settle on a word here. Should we call it art music?
Yeah, maybe art music.
Art music. Art music that's communicative and exciting and new and feels in conversation with these other genres that we've all grown up surrounded by, and I personally, really connected with as a kid and have always been interested in exploring.
For our first intermission is the first movement, entitled Fast, from Danielle's work for string quartet, Out of the Tunnel, performed here by Public Quartet. There is also a brilliant music video for this entire work that has been directed by James Mountford alongside dancer Amanda Francis, and you can access the link to further watch and listen to the rest of this work in the episode description. At what point during the process of working with them did you decide, or I don't know if it was collective or not, to make the music video series that came out of the piece?
Oh, that happened afterwards. That was a really fun part of the collaboration, actually. While making it, so that quartet originally was part of this big multimedia ballet called Infoxication, which was this whole, it was just this extravaganza with dance and crazy lighting and, you know, strobe lights and people climbing on chairs. And it was sort of like an like a dystopian sort of ballet that was Sleep No More meets The Office. It was a whole thing that we did. And that project had the Reich Triple Quartet on it as well. And so I knew that I needed to create something that felt really big, so that it wouldn't be kind of eclipsed by that gargantuan mammoth of a piece. And so in order to test that out, while I was writing it, I actually played it back against scenes from movies, so big trailers, the fight scene from The Matrix, all sorts of things. And for me, oftentimes the way I check that something kind of feels of the right scale is how it fits against a visual, even if there isn't necessarily going to be a visual in the final presentation. So the ballet had no video component whatsoever, but then when it came time to figure out what the visual aesthetic for the release was going to be, I already knew that the pieces fit really well with these big sort of grand cinematic vistas and dramatic camera work. And I got in touch with James Mountford, who's this wonderful director that I'd been talking about working on some projects with in LA. He works a lot with a drone. He has this just really incredible sensibility that integrates performance, like physical performance, so dancers, performers, with these epic cinematic sweeping landscapes from the California desert. And I just thought he would be the perfect person to kind of bring it to life and capture the original spirit of the writing process, but in visuals. And I think he did an absolutely incredible job. It was such a fun project. He was in LA and I was in New York, and we came up with the original concepts together, but I kind of just let him go off and do his thing because I love his work, and I thought I just trusted that he understood the music and he would do something that fit with it. Yeah, I mean, getting those video files back was just like unwrapping presents, and it was so gratifying as well because it's really a presentation of the music that felt like something that I'd really wanted to make for a while, that kind of, really, really came out the way that I had been hoping. And that was gratifying because, when you get to the end of projects, it doesn't always feel like that. So this one was very special.
And incredibly beautiful. I've watched it.
Thank you. Isn't he's unreal. Yeah.
Yes, all those shots are so beautiful.
Yeah, I think I'm hopefully going to work with him on some more projects as well. And he's a lovely guy too. Also English. So.
Oh, there we go.
Yes.
Wonderful.
Yeah.
Well, my other question has to do with another kind of musical side to your practice. Mm-hmm. Should I call it practice?
Sure.
Okay. Musical practice.
Musical practice. I mean, it makes me feel like I should be doing yoga or something, but.
Yeah, or meditation, right?
Yeah. Well, I try and meditate, actually, to go back to your earlier question about how to stay organized. Like, yeah, if I'm in a good headspace, I meditate quite a lot. So
I love it. So the other question was about the other side of your musical practice, about something that's come out relatively recently, I'd say last year, was your album.
Yes,
which is quite amazing, and I'm just.
Thank you.
Well, I mean, I've listened to it also several times because it's beautiful, and I'm definitely pop a link down so that anyone who's listening to us talk can also have a listen to it.
Great.
My favorite piece is The Philosopher. What is that particular experience working like? Because it's super collaborative working on an album, but in a studio setting rather than knowing that something's going to be premiered in a concert hall.
Yeah, I mean, I guess the difference with recording that kind of music as opposed to making like a classical album, when you make a classical album or art music album, I don't know why I can't can't figure out what I want to call this today. When you make an art music album, you show up and everyone knows exactly what they're going to play, and it's very kind of predetermined. And making the Danielle Eva record, there were certainly parts that were written out, but that's some of it, and the rest of it is honestly just making things up in the studio, because players improvise by nature, and that's why you bring particular people into the project to get their kind of their ideas on parts and arrangements, and well, I guess less so arrangements, but yeah, I mean, there were certainly parts that the keyboardist and guitar player and drummer that I was working with, they improve on what you've written, which is a really fun part of the process for me.
It's amazing. Correct me if I'm wrong, were you also the producer on it as well as the rest of the team members?
I was, yeah. So I worked with another producer, David Bottrell, who's got an incredible legacy in the rock and pop world, and I was really very, very privileged and honored to work with him. But he mostly came on when, after all of the songs had been demoed and sort of half produced, both here and then in London with another person that I work with named Pierce McIntyre. So all of the programming and the electronic elements were there, and then by the time we brought it back over to the States and Canada, actually, because I worked on quite a lot of it up in Toronto, that was, he got involved for the purposes of kind of really fleshing it out and bringing it to life and making it feel a little bit more live, because when I first started working on it, I wasn't sure whether it was going to be like an electronic kind of thing, but then it really started feeling like it wanted to go more in a band direction, and it kind of settled somewhere in the middle. And yeah, he'd been on my list of people that I wanted to work with for a while, because he made so many records that really influenced me, and also he just gets the most incredible guitar sounds and drum sounds, and really knows what to do with a band, because I feel like so many pop producers, there aren't as many kind of true rock bands as there used to be. It's more sort of studio projects and like pickup groups, and these things that kind of originate in the studio rather than through like people bashing songs out in a garage with a drum set and a guitar, and he comes from that world, and I really knew that I wanted someone who was really going to help me get that sound, rather than just sort of like integrating the odd electric guitar run through guitar rig next to some kind of beats that you threw together in Logic. Not to knock any of that, but just for this project, knowing where the influences came from, it was really important to me to have someone who came authentically from the rock world. And I learned a ton from him. And yeah, he's another one who's a really great person. Managed to pick up some good ones along the way.
For our second intermission is an excerpt from one of my favourite tracks from Danielle's 2020 album, which was released under Danielle's alias, Della Nilla. The album is entitled Overloaded, and this excerpt is from the track The Philosopher. If you haven't already, please go take a listen to the album, or even better, purchase a copy of the album Overloaded. when you're working in this environment in the studio, knowing that the first time the world sees it is basically when everything's recorded and it comes out and is released, how does that feel, knowing that it's a very different, broader audience that's going to show up as opposed to a premiere for an art music thing, which tends to be live and in a concert hall?
I hadn't really thought about that. I'm not sure why. I don't see much of a difference, to be honest. I just think it's you put something out into the world and people find it or don't find it, and they like it or they don't. I don't know. And I don't know that the classical audience is as small as we think it is, especially as contemporary concert music sort of crosses over more and more into film. I actually think there's a pretty broad audience for it. Perhaps not in the same way that there is for like Ariana Grande or someone like that, but yeah, there are definitely people listening. I mean, if you think about composers like Philip or Johann Johansson, these are artists that had really big followings, or Olafur Arnolds, people who kind of cross over but have a very strong compositional background. I mean, I think if you're writing like esoteric stuff with extended techniques that's only really ever going to be heard in a university setting, that's a little bit different, but that's never what I've been interested in doing. I've sort of been interested in making stuff not for a popular audience, that's the wrong word, but just for an audience that doesn't need a music degree to understand it.
Yes,
I guess. Yeah, I don't really think of it any differently. Maybe that's wrong, but in my head it all feels the same.
Well, to me, that's amazing. What you mentioned about like people not needing a degree to understand it, I feel like that's quite important, because otherwise, I mean, there's no accessibility point if we need a degree to understand any kind of art.
I think so too. I mean, I feel like that with all forms of art, actually. Like, if it needs a program note or a description on next to the painting, or some kind of like advanced training to understand it, then it's that, in my eyes, I think that's less successful. Which is not to say that I think like art should be kind of dumbed down, overly accessible and simplistic or anything like that. But I think, and I forget where I read this or heard it, but it was someone talking about how, like, in order for a piece of art to be good, it has to check 3 boxes. It has to have some kind of technical skill, it has to be original, and it has to make you feel something kind of right off the bat. Not to say that, like, a piece can't have like a few minutes to unfold or whatever, but I kind of feel like that's the closest to a successful and applicable definition of like what good art is that I've heard. And I feel like that stands, and that's certainly how I think about music as well. You don't have to write something that's like dumbed down and overly accessible, but it does have to speak to people. Like, that's your job as a creator. I'm not really interested in making kind of like, weird geeky stuff for my own amusement and benefit in my like tiny room. I'm interested in making things that have the potential to like speak to people, hopefully. All of my favorite artists have worked that way too. And I've never understood in the concert music world why that's seen as like selling out or being overly, I think it's a shame, or overly like not commercial. Commercial is the wrong word, but what's wrong with wanting to be communicative and wanting people to be able to not even understand, but like intuitively feel connected to your music? What's wrong with that?
I've never understood it either. I remember when I was studying at a conservatorium years ago, someone made the comment of basically that we were selling out and that I might as well be a pop musician. But then there's nothing wrong with being a pop musician either.
No.
Yeah.
I mean, to me, I feel like the most interesting art is, it has to be, I like intelligent music. I'll get bored listening to like a 2 or 3 chord pop song, which is not to say that there aren't 2 or 3 chord pop songs. Like, for me, I'm interested in writing stuff that is like complex and hopefully, pushes some boundaries somewhere. It's not like I'm interested in writing easy dumb music, but I don't know, things don't have to be like overly complicated for the sake of it. I think there's a lot to be said for like simplicity and sort of a clarity of ideas as well.
I like the idea that in some ways, well, I hope maybe I'm being too naive, but that music performance or just music in general can be a site where people can just collect and participate and interact.
I think so. Yeah, completely. And I have always felt strongly about that. And I feel even more strongly about artists playing that role now that we are hopefully coming out of the pandemic. I always felt like the value of music. Obviously, there's in the private moments where you're at home and you're alone and you're listening to something that really makes you feel like connected and kind of speaks to the moment. That's incredibly valuable, obviously. But for me, the thing that I think is like more culturally valuable is the way that it really binds people together. It gives people sort of like membership to a certain group or like a certain tribe. You know, for me, my best friends in high school, and I mean, music has always kind of actually been a gathering force within my kind of social groups. Like my friends in high school, where we just like saw each other in the halls wearing the same band t-shirt, and then we're like, oh, this person listens to this band, like they must kind of speak my language, and then you connect with people that way. And I mean, what other, aside from I guess maybe sports, like yeah, gathering for a concert, that's something that binds people together regardless of like political affiliation or socioeconomic background, unless you're talking about like concerts for the Phil, which are, you know, tickets for the Phil, which are prohibitively expensive. Yeah, across language barriers, across sort of political and religious divides. It's, you know, things that really like speak to the human experience on a profound level and in a way that you can't really quantify or qualify or put into words. And I think that was always what made me wanted to be part of it. I wanted to be part of something that unified people and brought them together. And I think, you know, coming out of this year plus of isolation, artists have a job to do in reestablishing these kind of like shared spaces and experiences and helping people to remember the joy of gathering, I guess. Hopefully that doesn't sound too like kumbaya, but
no, not at all. Because as much as I do love online experiences, it felt isolating, even though I knew everyone else was watching as well. There's something about having bodies in a room that can't be replaced.
No, for sure. I mean, I think all of the online stuff is actually kind of cool and interesting, but it's interesting to me in the same way that like video is a different medium from live performance. It's a different space and you can figure out what to do with it. Like what kind of creative things can be done with the live stream or some kind of other online event, as opposed to an in-person one. They're not one is not a substitute for the other. They're just different platforms and spaces to explore.
Well, I think that's what I found the most compelling about your work, is that you didn't just, well, I mean, I don't mean to be rude to the other very old institutions out there, but you didn't just kind of replace the audience with a still camera, which happened for a lot of the concerts that I happened to attend, and a lot of them were put on by very, very classical institutions that were running online concerts for the last 18 months. Instead, you provided us with this entirely integrated artistic experience, and then there was a whole aesthetic story that came along with this, and I found that very, very amazing.
I'm very, very happy to hear that that's what's come through. Yeah, I don't know. I've also just I've become a little bit of like a camera work geek. I don't know. I don't like, like you said, I don't like to sit and just watch a static camera. Like, who cares? I think that like filmmaking is kind of its own art in itself, and anytime you're dealing with anything online, you're just kind of you're dealing with the camera. It's just part of the equation, which is not to say that I have any skill like on the level of a real cinematographer or I mean, obviously I don't know anything about cinematography, but I'm not a professional filmmaker. I'm someone who's like picked up things here and there, I guess. But yeah, even by doing that, it's such a mystifying and fascinating art form to me, how people create like really compelling visual video content again.
I suppose this goes back to what we were talking about right at the beginning. I don't know why I didn't ask it then, but you mentioned briefly that you thought of the visuals as you're writing the music. Is that now that you're working more with filmmakers and your collaborators, cinematographers or producers in the visual world, as well as yourself, is that something that's much more present in the way that you write? Do you think visually before the music?
Yes, I do now. I'm trying to think when the last time that I wrote something that didn't feel connected to a visual. I can't remember. Yeah, I guess it always, yeah, it's mostly connected to a visual, even if it's just in my head. But that's often sort of almost for the purposes of like whittling down, or not even, maybe whittling down is the wrong word, but making the blank slate feel less daunting, because it's kind of just something to push generally and gently in the direction of. So if you know that you're kind of, no one likes to sit down with the blank page and think, oh my God, I could write anything. What am I going to do? This could be this, it could be something else. And then sometimes it becomes very difficult to start. But I find if I have a visual in mind, it just kind of, it focuses things a little bit more. So I'm no longer thinking about like looking at things in a broad way. I'm like a horse with kind of blinkers on, so I can only see what's there rather than the other possibilities.
Amazing. I think I may have to try that one day. And on that note, I have a kind of open but also super broad and specific question, and I always ask it at the end, which is, do you have any advice for any very young musician or artist who's coming up and doesn't really know how to navigate either the classical music world / art music world and working collaboratively in that space?
I don't know if this exactly answers your question, but it's probably advice I would give in general. So we're going to try and fit it into that. I think it's really just make sure that you pay a significant amount of attention to building the business side of what you're doing, but not to the point where that overshadows what you're trying to do creatively. Because at the end of the day, if what you're writing is bad, it doesn't matter how many Twitter followers you have or, how glossy all of the kind of material around it is. It kind of just comes down to like, I don't know why I keep using all of these like marketing words today. I guess I've been in record mode, but like, it's like, if you're selling iPhones, like if the product is bad, it doesn't matter how good the imagery and all of it around it is. It kind of just all comes down to like, what's the core of what you're doing. So you have to, you have to make sure that that your work is really great, but you also, it doesn't matter if you have the best work in the world, but you're afraid of like dealing with the business side, or you think it's icky, or you don't want to get involved with it. No one's going to hear it. So I think trying to navigate that kind of balancing act and making sure that you give your work the best chance at success and really think critically about it as a business person is very important, but not more important than making sure that your work says what you want it to say, and you're putting out the best material that you can.
That is actually very, very useful advice. And you've actually answered all of my questions.
Great.
Yeah, thank you so much for answering all of my questions. It's been a pleasure.
Yeah, it really has. Thank you for asking good ones and and having me. It's been so much fun.
So thank you so much again, Danielle. It's been such a pleasure to meet with you and to get to talk with you and to share our various thoughts about classical / art music / Western instrumental music. For everyone who's still listening out there, all the information about Danielle's work, her previous interviews, writing, as well as how to access the music videos or films that we've mentioned, as well as her album, are all linked below. Thank you all for listening, and catch you next month for the next installment of Declassify Season 2.